Welcome back, everyone. My name is Dimitris Kralis. I'm a professor of Byzantine history at the Department of Humanities and director of the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies. And I'm really, really thankful for the work that Irini, Alessandra, and Jamie have done, bringing together this symposium and allowing for the kinds of conversations that are already happening on issues that are very much of interest to everyone at a global level. Today, on this panel, we will be discussing migrations in Antiquity and the Middle Ages. I edited the Renaissance since there was a slight change in the panel composition at the last moment, we will be looking at perspectives that come from the world of archaeology, but also philology and history of the late antique and Byzantine era. Transition to Dr. Sergio Basso, who's the Hellenism's past and present, local and global postdoctoral fellow at the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies. He's a philologist of the Greek language, which he studies in its complex linguistic contexts of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. However, the past 15 years, he has also intensively worked as a film director. Dr. Basso's latest documentary, Sarita, was screened at the Vancouver International Film Festival just recently. During his time at the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies, Dr. Basso will finalize his book manuscript on the transmission of the Barlaam and Yoasaph story, a peculiar Christianized form of the life of Buddha as a saint's life. Today's paper is going to be titled Migration Under the Byzantine Empire, the Case of the Hot Border in Nisibis. And without further ado, I pass it on to you, Sergio.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Professor Kralis. And I need to thank Irini, Alessandra, and James for the very kind invitation to this decidedly riveting webinar. So we've been speaking so far about people migrating. We've been seeing the cases of people, out of metaphor, walking through wide territories. But can a whole city migrate? Can a whole city move, even with its own architecture, actually? I picked up several examples of late antiquity and actually Middle Ages as well, where this happened. So I'd like to share them with you. The first case is the case of Antioch, which moved twice. In 272, upon Aurelian's revenge, after the Empress Zenobia's raised to power, the Syriac middle bourgeoisie that feared Aurelian's reaction actually escaped en masse to Emesa. Okay, so it takes like 5 days walking to get there. That means that when we consider that entails a huge change in the urban texture of Antioch. When we speak of Antioch in 270 and Antioch in the 4th century, they are two totally different cities from the point of view of texture, of citizenship. And the same happened actually in 540 when Khosrow the First destroyed Antioch and created a second Antioch. Let me share the screen with you. Here we are. So this is Antioch, and this is Emesa, the 5 days journey. And this is actually the new Antioch that Khosrow built after the conquest of Antioch in 540. So he forced the whole mass of citizens to migrate from the city to the new city that he founded with the help of the former citizens of the the old Antioch, and they founded a city called actually where Antioch Khosrow. In Middle Persian sounds the better Antioch, the one built by Khosrow. Okay, Antiochia Khosrow in Greek. This policy of deportation was well known to Assyrians, Babylonians, Achaemenids, Sasanians, and Romans. In Latin, it's called deductio. But I've chosen Nisibis. That's the main focus of my talk, because this city actually migrated without moving. So I'd love to discover the place with you, understand its importance, and revive some of his inhabitants, his main characters, through the power of philology. Maybe we will discover that philology can be an unsuspectedly warm discipline. So let's start from the position, first of all, the location. This is Nisibis. You see that gooseneck corridor? It is going to play an important role in our discussion later. That from Europe leads straight to Central Asia, to the Silk Road. And now for a little bug in PowerPoint, you have to cope with a little bit of patience. And let's go back to the previous slide. Today, Nisibis is split into two parts exactly. Let me show you. The line is kind of, damn it. The line is kind of slowed down. You can see the PowerPoint slides in this way as well, right? Without me launching the presentation. Nisibis is today split into two parts. Let me show you. One is the city of Nusaybin, the historical continuation of Nisibis in Turkey, and the other is Al-Kamishli in Syria. So the frontier is still there today. It's a frontier city, and it is still a border city with no man's land, as you can see here. You see, we have the new Nisibis and the new Syriac city here, with a strip of no man's land in the middle. And the name of the city, the etymology of the name, was probably, well, there are several conjectures, but I think that we should look for the Semitic root nasaba with emphatic S, which meant to plant or to erect a stele. But so it's a planted city. It's an artificial creation. And unfortunately, I'm sorry, the semantic drift is not upon me. It's due to the local culture in the past times. It meant created object and spouse, wife as well. And I guess that the real meaning of the toponym was the wife of the desert, because actually it was the name of Palmyra as well. Probably what happened is that in the Semitic languages, in Mandaic, for example, Nasaba meant created, artificially created city, and the same word meant wife, because the same root means to marry as well. So when translated into Greek, the interpreters understood the name as the spouse, and that applied both to Palmyra and to Nisibis in different languages. I prepared some maps to show you the table tennis history of the conquest between the Roman and the Persian Empire of that frontier. So we have an history that dates back from the 4th century on up to the 4th century. So the 1st century BC to the 4th century AD. You see an enlargement of the area. So in the 1st century, it was Macedonian. Then it was Parthian, then Roman. Crassus had their legiones there. Then Parthian again, then Roman, then Persian, then Roman, then Persian, then Sassanid, then Roman, then Sassanid finally. And this drift between the Roman and the Persian side, the Roman and the Persian watershed, led to some identity issues, identity crises among several intellectuals. For example, there is a wonderful, funny anecdote in Lucian, Post de Historia Syngraphing, Como de Historia Conscribendasi, chapter 24. Lucian is a great sophist of the 1st century, but most probably he wasn't a Greek native speaker. He was Syriac, and he was called Mesopotamic because the area between Samosata, where he was born, and Nisibis fell near the border with between Syria and Mesopotamia. So he was addressed as a Mesopotamic writer when he held conferences and lectures all over the Mediterranean world. So he jokes and he says, everybody's calling me Mesopotamian, but I'm Syriac, actually. And this recognition, this acknowledgement of the Syriac identity by a Greek speaker in the 3rd century should be extremely important to the ears of a Greek philologist today. And Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman general, was there while the city was lost to the Persian Empire. And it's funny because he called the local outpost as impregnable, urbs inexpugnabilis, and murus provinciarum, bulwark of the provinces. So why did they lose, and what was at stake? Why was Nisibis so important? So let's see the position again. And I found for you this Tabula Peutingeriana. It's a 12th, 13th century copy of an ancient Roman map where we can see Nisibis here. And what was at stake? At stake, there was what we would call it today the forex, the foreign exchange market, because at the east of Nisibis, the rest of the empire functioned on a gold standard. The Byzantine Empire used gold coins as standard, while the Persian Empire and the rest of the Silk Road used the silver standard. And the only place, if you had a caravan and wanted to trade between Anatolia and the Silk Road, where you were supposed to change your coins, was Nisibis, okay? As I showed you before in the map, Nisibis was an outpost that controlled the Guzness corridor between Anatolia and the Silk Road. Actually, all the Silk Road trades after the 3rd century was based on a silver standard. Persians ruled. Archaeologists recovered aurei, golden coins from the Roman Empire, from the Silk Road. They were amulets, actually. They are not hoards. They're single retrievals on the tongue of dead traders, for example. They were found in the tombs. This historical recap shows that the whole story of the school of Nisibis, a very important Christian exegetical school from the 5th century on, falls under Persian rule. And if you're interested, we could talk about this in the question and answer session. The focus point that I would like to assess is this frontier didn't actually exist. It was very osmotic, decidedly permeable, and we have some sources about how local subjects perceived the stateship, the the status of the states of the two empires. Ancient empires didn't care about aerial possession. They cared about trade routes and tax collection. Sometimes they did foster canalization and the creation of new fields, of new infrastructures for the populace. They didn't do that for the benefit and happiness of their subjects. They just needed more capita, as Latin would say, more heads to be fiscally vexed. We have an easy check for that. The control of mountains. Ancient empires, Indian Maurya Empire, for example, with Chandragupta, the great opponent of Alexander the Great, Sassanids, Romans never cared about the control of mountains. Let me show you a picture of a Monte Sorate. It's a mountain that Romans never, we see a recap of the possession of Nisibis under purple, Byzantine, and yellow, Persian possession. So golden and silver standard, and Monte Sorato. This mountain was never conquered by the Romans. And you know where it is? It lies 40 kilometers from Rome. And it was the den of bandits. And the soldiers never managed to control it, but they didn't care because they didn't tax the mountaineers. We have demonstration of the control of trade routes in Nisibis. A milestone was found on the Nisibis-Singaro road at Karsi, today Jebel Sinjar. It's now lost. And the southern route, on the other hand, has been completely obliterated by the expansion of Al-Kamishli, the Syriac city. We have literary evidence of the existence of the legiones, of the legions at that outpost. Scarce evidence, actually. We have one papyrus and one reference in the Notitia Dignitatum. We know that in Nisibis, Legio Prima Partica et Legio Tertia Partica, the first and the third legions available in the Middle East were settled, were stationed. We have archaeological evidence, even though archaeological investigation is impossible now. As the ground between the modern frontiers is seeded with landmines, no archaeological work has been carried out there. But this zone should have been the southern limits of the city, where the defensive walls guarded the Jakjak Valley and the route to the Kabur confluence. Okay, so you see this no man's land here? It's still expecting excavation. The only remains we have are a church I'm gonna show you. And as for the presence of, this is the only surviving building of the old Nisibis, now within the historic center of Nusaybin, the baptistry of Mar Yaqub was a bishop in the period 309-338. As for the presence of this inexpugnabilis murus provinciarum, this impregnable wall, well, actually, these are the columns of a temple in no man's land. There are no traces of the wall. Not anymore. At least we can reconstruct it from. We can reconstruct the walls from the arch of Septimius Severus in Rome. It's a detail from the Fornix, and we can compare the walls in Sagir, a southern city. This is a sort of twin city of Nisibis. Daesh conquered the city in the previous years, so they destroyed many ancient monuments, unfortunately. We can recover some Polaroids from the past of Nisibis. I promised at the beginning that I would have tried to revive some characters. We found an epigraph, a rectangular limestone slab with a central epigraph framed on both sides. The epitaph commemorates a woman, Domnina, who died at age 45. The inscription goes, dis manibus Domnina vixitanis quadrinciaquinque Saturnius Lucius Amidris coiunx eius titulum posuit suo, to the gods manes, to the gods manes. Domnina lived 45 years. Saturninus Lucius from Hydra, near Tunis, unbelievable. Her husband offered this inscription with his money. So we find the same individual as a soldier of Legio Prima Minerva on another stele found near Düsseldorf in present-day Germany. So this accounts for the circulation of people in the empire in the 3rd century, an unbelievable circulation from Tunis to present-day Turkey back to Germany. If anybody is interested, I would be more than happy to share the slides with the bibliographic indications of the papyri and the epigraphs I mentioned. And the last character I'd like to revive before your eyes is John of Tela, an ascetic. We have several sources about his life. We are in the 6th century. And after 518, the emperors Justin and Justinian had decided to uphold the doctrine of a Christ with two natures, espoused by the Council of Chalcedon, and the Chalcedonians, who supported the council, were thereby encouraged to persecute their doctrinal opponents, the anti-Chalcedonians. John of Tela wasn't Chalcedonian. So John was the propagator of the ideas of a great theologian, Severus of Antioch. Wow. Cavafis doesn't believe in me. He's not supporting me. He's the master of the generation of the next generation by Jakub Baradeus, a very important theologian that flourished after 542. Sometime after 542, an author named Elias wrote John's hagiography, John's life, in Syriac. The literary form of this life is actually a letter of encouragement, a letter that Elias addressed to a certain anti-Chalcedonian faithful during the hardship that arose after John's death in 538. And it was clearly intended to encourage them to persist in their faith amid persecution and uncertainty. Elias depicted John as the creator of a true Christian politeia, in later pronunciation politia. It uses the Syriac word. It's a Syriac calque for the Greek word politia, which actually witnesses the pronunciation of the diphthong in a closed form, politia, not politeia. And Elias defended John against charges of treason that he claimed to have been leveled against him by both Romans and Persian authorities, who had likened John to a bandit and a social outsider. So what happened? John created a network of monks, a sort of monastic community spread all over the territory around Nisibis. But the problem wasn't religion. The problem is that he managed to run the village-based structure of the area, collecting actually parallel taxation in order to help both the monks and the villagers. And this was the factor that was insultant to both the Byzantine and the Persian authorities. The second factor of crisis, the second issue, the second problem was that Nisibis was exactly an outpost, as we saw, at the frontier. While John didn't care about that border, the monastic network expanded itself on both sides of the watershed, of this mental watershed, so to speak. So he collected money, managed the area, infringed the political perception of the local identity. That was the problem, not religion, but it was attacked on religious premises, so to speak. An anonymous author of an ecclesiastical chronicle employed the Greek loanword politia to describe this network, as I told you. What could this politia mean? Politia in Greek means statute, a regime of life. In the Syriac case, it could be the translation of Middle Persian den, which on its turn, it's the back translation of the Greek nomos, so a law, again, a regime of life. It could become, the word then will become the Arabic din, which still today means religion in Greek. Severus of Antiochia, the theological teacher of John of Tela, used politeia in several passages of his work. In Severus' eyes, in Severus' words, to have a politia was to be a member of a community and to assume the cult and behavior of that community. In another letter of Severus, that letter used the term politia to describe the community and laws that Moses had established for Jews. In this letter, Moses' politia served as a point of contrast with that of the gospel, which had supplanted it through the intercession of Christ. I'd like to
Sergio, keep in mind that we are at around 20 minutes. So.
Yep. I'm exactly concluding. I'd like to conclude this. I'm actually on purpose chopping off the way the story ends for real, because I'd like to end this story with a happy end. So I'd like to conclude with John's own words when he got arrested by the authorities and he went under trial under the Sassanid Empire, under the Persians. And once John was captured and brought to Nisibis, the Marthban in Elias' account, the local governor, accused him of a series of crimes that were based, as Elias hinted, on Ephraim, that is John's opponent's presentation of John's activity. The first was that John had crossed into our land without our permission, thereby entering another politia. The second was that he was collecting much gold from those who came to him, thereby collecting and redistributing wealth among the local communities over which he had influence. The third was that he was rebelling against Caesar and those who ruled his land. Well, as per the accusation of handling gold, John denied that he had collected any gold. I think that that's strange, and he probably blatantly lied or used a sophism. Probably did he handle silver in Persia, as I showed you before, and not gold. But I'd like to conclude with a wonderful John's answer to the Persian governor, an answer that is a token of hope. Today, when there is this complete peace between these two empires, I do not know politeia from politeia, for the two emperors are brothers in love. If I'm here, I think that I'm among the Romans. If I am among the Romans, I think that I'm here because of the peace. And this is the last quotation by John of Tela I'd like to conclude with. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sergio. I myself have some questions. I want to see if there is any reactions to both papers from our panelists and attendees.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. So I have two questions from Alessandra, and I'll start with the one addressed to Sergio. Alessandra goes, you have made an argument about the tremendous circulation of people during the empire of the 3rd century. Do you have any evidence of the way in which such circulation affected identities in relation to the politia. Is the politia an archaic form of national belonging? I was intrigued by your last quotation of Ioannis, but I was also wondering what role the circulation of people had in the subjectification of individuals versus local law. Alessandra, you opened a can of worms, by the way, a wonderful one, but...
I will answer with one sentence. No, okay. It's a chest of drawers. I would use the concept of several strata. And unfortunately, philologists and even historians of literature have to deal with the first one, which is actually the most superficial, which is the way rhetoric, pedagogy, literature wanted all those identities to be represented to posterity, which is a totally fictional view. But we have to trust that view. We can't but have confidence in that reconstruction, which is a very artificial construction of identity. So, for example, we scarcely notice that Lucian was a Syriac because he's one of the master of Greek language, but most probably Greek wasn't his native tongue, as I highlighted, maybe in a risky way, but actually. John, in other cases, much later, John of Damascus, he was Arab. He's one of the greatest Islamic Greek rhetoricians. So that's the first layer with bilingual intellectuals, at least bilingual, if not trilingual, because till the middle of the 3rd century, if you were summoned to trial in the Roman Empire and you wanted to defend yourself, you were requested to do it in Latin. You had to be able to speak Latin in court till 270, I'd say, after Diocletian. Then we have a second stratum, that is the stratum of soldiers and traders, merchants. Soldiers were allowed to circulate all over the empire, and they obtained, so to speak, this permission of circulation. They enjoyed it, they exploited it widely, even because they were exploited by the empire. They were actually, we could define the militia, their job, the Militian profession, as the profession of the people allowed to circulate freely in the empire, plus the merchants. Please let me remind you that traders were usually considered to be spies, and they actually were often spies. They were the informers of the other empires. So they weren't seen positively, they were seen with suspicion. We must trust, we must have confidence in the so-called Oxyrhynchus papyri, the papyri archaeologists found in Egypt, to try to shed some light on the life of the 3rd stratum, the peasants, normal people with their desire, their dreams, their nightmares. Thanks to the litanies, to the Euchologia in the monastic books, even later in the 8th century, we can have access to the nightmares, to the inmost fears of the peasants. And that reveals a totally different world in terms of identity. So an identity, for example, as the Syriac identity, that what we call Syriac is actually Aramaic, is Northern Aramaic. Syriac is basically very close, linguistically speaking, to the dialect that Jesus used. And we label it Syriac for a lot of historical reasons in order to efface, actually, the connection with Aramaic, okay? Unfortunately, we might say, even in the using of those labels, we can delete identities. That kind of self-perception as a Syriac, for example, had always been. Then Romans came, they vexate people with taxes, Those peasants had to understand sometimes Latin, sometimes Greek to interact with the administration, later Arabic, but their mothers, generation after generation, spoke Syriac. Does it help to define identity? Just one of the factors. Language is one of the factors. The ability of creating a network and connecting that network to territory and win the conquerors is one more factor. Syriac people did it well. Sometimes, for example, if you take the success of the push by the Empress Zenobia from 269 to 272, it took only 2 to 3 years to her to create a huge empire in the Middle East. How did she manage to do so if a lot of local populace hadn't been ready to intercept a certain discourse about, let's call it Levantine identity, for example, okay, in contrast with the Greek exploitation?
Yeah, if I may jump in on that, Alessandra, you're opening a really crucial conversation, and you're right to latch on to John of Tela, because he's quite a character existing in both these milieus. It's really tricky, and we're still struggling in late antique and then later on Byzantine studies in understanding how people imagined themselves, what kind of a community did they inhabit. All these populations, to the degree that they were free and not slaves, had since the early 3rd century been Roman citizens. So you could say that they're hyphenated Syriac Romans. And that Roman identity could be a strong identity on specific historical moments. How did it differ from the identity of a person who defined himself as a Greek on the coastal cities, more in touch with other Greek populations in Mediterranean networks? This is still something for research to explore. For the later Byzantine period, things become simpler because it's a much smaller territory. There is much greater linguistic homogeneity, and we can start speaking of a quasi-nationally conceived Romanness of Greek speakers, of course. So Westerners get confused often with that. But this is a crucial question, but I'm really interested in this idea that, in a way, Sergio brings up, the can a city move? Because it takes you past this idea of the city as a physical space. And yesterday, I think Sanam raised the question, can we think of homes in more complicated ways? And it constructs the city as the sum total of its members. So it's a political community that could exist anywhere. And from the Phocians, who in face of Persian danger, move their whole population to go to Corsica, Chios first and then Corsica in the Archaic era, to the Athenians turning to the rest of the Greeks and saying, hey, if you don't fight at Salamis, we're going to get on our ships and leave our cities, our ships. There is something about the idea that people cannot simply be conceived as moving individuals, but as a concrete political community that can also move. And what is complicated by Sergio's sort of picture is the idea that here the physical community is actually stable. What changes is the border as it takes it in or out constantly in a territory where the two empires do not have complete control over how the local population defines itself. And there things start getting very complicated. But anyhow, that's just more of a general comment than a question. I don't see any other questions. So unless someone has a final thought, I would like to thank both our presenters for stimulating material and presentations, and renew our appointment for 2 o'clock for the next panel.